Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce today briefly AmberIvanov. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences in Sofia. She has taught before at Ghent University and at the Sofia University St. Clement Ohridsky. And in Ghent, she completed her PhD in 2023 with a thesis on the first translation of the Thecla in Old Church Slavonic. She's already published on these topics in English and Bulgarian and is preparing a critical edition of the text. And today she'll be speaking about the character of Paul in the Slavic acts of Thecla. Amber, the floor is yours.
Yes, okay. Let me share my screen for the presentation. So here we go. I hope everyone sees this. And we can begin. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer of this project, Dan, for putting together such an excellent program of online lectures and for fostering a community around this intriguing and fascinating topic. I'm also very grateful for the opportunity to explore this particular aspect of the Slavic tradition, something I deeply appreciate. Today, I will be discussing the portrayal of the Apostle Paul in the Acts of Thecla as introduced, and whether we can identify any differences in this representation within the Slavic translation compared to the original Greek text. I will begin with a general introduction to the topic and then move on to the textual data to illustrate my points. Please note that if the Slavic version is not specifically mentioned, this indicates that no significant discrepancies were detected between the Greek original and its translation. The Acts of Thecla, also known as the Acts of Paul and Thecla, have long been a central focus of scholarly research. I have listed some of the more significant and comprehensive contributions on this slide for those who maybe wish to explore the literature further. However, this list is by no means exhaustive. In fact, especially over the past 3 or even 4 decades, we have witnessed a remarkable increase in scholarly work on this text, approaching it from a wide range of disciplines and perspectives. Among the many topics of interest is the portrayal of the Apostle Paul as a literary character. I will briefly summarize the main points of this discussion, although I must emphasize that my own investigation is still in its early stages. I am in the process of still collecting data, and I hope that other specialists may contribute to this subject from different angles so that together we can develop a more comprehensive understanding of Paul's character in this text. Previous research has shown that, like many other biblical writings, the Acts of Thecla have a complex textual history. They were transmitted both independently and in conjunction with other works, particularly as part of the broader Act of Paul. This dual transmission history partly explains why many scholars have observed that the Apostle Paul seems to be inserted into the narrative in a rather awkward or abrupt manner, a view with which I agree. This has led to the hypothesis that the Acts of Thecla did not originally form part of the Acts of Paul, but rather existed as an independent narrative. Paul's inclusion likely came later and was motivated by the desire to lend the text greater authority and authenticity. After all, what could confer more legitimacy than the presence of the Apostle Paul himself? In fact, one might argue that the Acts of Thecla play a distinct role in reshaping Paul's image from the Pauline tradition within a new literary and theological context. How so, you might ask? Although Thecla is not mentioned in any of Paul's epistles, she is depicted in the Acts as a converted disciple and at times a companion throughout her life. The narrative also reflects the developments or perhaps reinterpretation of Pauline teaching as found in 1 Corinthians, particularly concerning baptism, sexual renunciation, abstention from marriage, and the role of women in early Christianity. Paul's ambiguous characterization is even acknowledged within the Pauline corpus itself. In 2 Corinthians, for example, it is said of him, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. For reference, the Pauline epistles are generally dated to the late 1st and early 2nd century, while the Acts of Thecla are more convincingly assigned to the late 2nd century. Thus, it is far more plausible that the Acts draw upon and reinterpret the Pauline letters rather than influencing them. One particularly valuable passage is the unique description of Paul's appearance at the beginning of the Acts, when the people of Iconium anticipate his arrival. This portrayal aligns closely with the quotation from 2 Corinthians, as Paul is assigned physical traits typically interpreted negatively from a physiognomic standpoint. This aligns with what Daniel Hughes describes as Paul's, and I quote, strained self-presentation and rhetoric in the Corinthian correspondence. I will return to this point later in the presentation. As Peter Ben Smith has argued, the Acts of Thecla serve to legitimize Thecla while simultaneously reshaping the image of Paul. This occurs both at the level of content and literary structure. To begin, we will examine Paul's introduction as an active character within the narrative, followed by an analysis of his more passive presence later in the text. His active presence can be assessed through his direct speech and actions that influence the story's progression. By way of background, scholars of the Greek text's transmission, such as Lipsius, Bonnet, but also Castley and Rohrdorff, the latter two currently preparing a new edition, generally divide the text into 43 chapters. A survey of Paul's direct speech across the text reveals that his speeches are more substantial and significant at the beginning, but diminish progressively towards the end. Paul's first recorded words in the Acts of Thecla are the series of Beatitudes found in chapters 5 and 6, 13 in total. In the Slavic translation, however, Beatitude number 8, which concerns wisdom, that's the first one in chapter 6 on the slide, is omitted, likely due to its absence in the Greek exemplar. Other Beatitudes are occasionally missing in the Slavic tradition, likely due to scribal errors, but this is not our primary concern today. These Beatitudes are noteworthy for several reasons. Most importantly, they establish a direct intertextual link with the Beatitudes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5, 1 to 12, although only two, on mercy and purity of heart, Matthew 5.6, 7 and 5:8, are directly borrowed. The Acts of Thecla introduce these Beatitudes as the Word of God on moderation of the flesh and on resurrection. Yet they encompass broader themes such as wisdom, fear of God, knowledge, mercy, and the renunciation of possessions or social status. Only two Beatitudes, highlighted here in yellow, explicitly address sexual continence. However, these should be understood more broadly, as extolling a virtue applicable to both married and unmarried Christians. See also Clement of Rome with Shepherd of Hermas, which is cited by Susan Helen in 2015. Scholars have also drawn attention to parallels in 1 Corinthians, where themes of continence and resurrections are developed in length, notably in chapters 6 and 7. Both Beatitudes in question include fragmentary references to these passages. It is therefore clear that the author of the act is guiding the audience towards a specific interpretation of Paul, even if Paul's own speech encompasses multiple themes. As we will see, the motive of chastity, and more specifically Thecla's rejection of marriage to Tamiris, becomes the central driving force of the narrative. Thus, the author's early emphasis on continence is quite fitting within the broader structure and message of the text. Paul's next substantial speech occurs in paragraph 17 when he is summoned before the governor and to defend himself. In this moment, his role in the narrative becomes quite clear. He presents himself as someone sent by God to proclaim the gospel and bring hope to the people, emphasizing that his teachings are not unjust. This gives us two firm and confident speeches early in the narrative in which Paul articulates his character, purpose, and primary concerns, spanning 13 and 8 lines of text respectively, more or less. However, as we continue to trace Paul's direct speech throughout the text, we observe a noticeable shift. From this point forward, Paul speaks only sporadically and in increasingly shorter utterances. For example, in paragraph 23, he says, "Go, my child, and buy many breads and bring them." In paragraph 24, "Father of Jesus Christ, do not let Thecla be overtaken in the fire, but be with her, since she is yours." Also in paragraph 24, "God, knower of hearts, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, I thank you because you hastened to give to me and responded to me that which I asked." In chapter 25, when Thecla proposes shaving her head, "O shameless time, and you are beautiful. May another trial not leave you worse than the first, and you might not endure, but you might be cowardly." And his refusal of baptism follows. "Be patient, and you will receive the water." In Antioch, when Thecla is assaulted by Alexander, Paul responds with detachment. "The woman you speak of, I do not know, she is not mine." And finally, in chapter 41, "Go and teach the word of God." What becomes clear is that Paul gradually fades into the background over the course of the narrative. From the midpoint onward, he no longer drives the plot or delivers substantive teaching. By the end, his role is reduced to merely validating decisions already made by others. Paul delivers a few additional speeches, 4 in total, that are referred to indirectly in the text, phrased vaguely as, for example, the blessed acts of Christ or general mentions of him preaching. These are not especially informative for our purposes here and will be set aside. In stark contrast, a look at Thecla's direct speech reveals the opposite trajectory. She is introduced as a character in chapter 7, but remains silent until chapter 22. Before that point, she listens in awe, internalizing Paul's words. Her early speech consists mostly of brief responses or statements. However, by the end of the narrative, she delivers 2 of the most eloquent and impactful speeches. In chapter 37, when she introduces herself before the governor during her second trial in the arena, and in chapter 42, when she offers a final prayer of thanksgiving to God. In other words, the disciple has become the teacher. This brings us to the next stage of analysis, Paul's presentation as a passive character. That is, when he's mentioned or described by others rather than acting or speaking himself. I will first examine his actions, or in many cases his lack of action, followed by an analysis of how other characters represent or characterize him through the text. So the original title of the text was almost certainly The Acts of Paul and Thecla. However, in the course of its later Greek transmission, and consequently in the Slavic tradition, this title is completely replaced. The text is now referred to as the Passion of Thecla, omitting any mention of Paul. This shift reflects a significant transformation in function and reception of the text. It is no longer read as part of the Acts of Paul, but rather as a standalone hagiographical narrative intended to celebrate Thecla as a saint and martyr. This new designation aligns with its liturgical use. In the Slavic context, the text is read on Thecla's feast day, September 24, emphasizing her sanctity and her role as a Christian exemplar. Yet intriguingly, the narrative still opens with Paul, specifically with his journey from Antioch to Iconium. This not only anchors the story in a historical geographical setting, but also subtly retains its original literary context within the Acts of Paul. Only in two much later East Slavic manuscripts, one from the 16th and another from the late 17th century, do we see the addition of epithets, such as the Great Apostle of Christ or the Holy Apostle. Otherwise, Paul appears in the Slavic reception without explicit markers or his apostleship. Scholars of the Greek tradition, such as Gregory and Daniel Hughes, have interpreted this as a deliberate literary strategy. Rather than foregoing Paul's apostolic authority, the text emphasizes his role as a teacher, an appropriate framing given Thecla's position as his disciple and spiritual successor. In paragraph 21, Thecla believes she sees Paul in the crowd during her first trial at the stake. However, it quickly becomes apparent that this is not Paul himself, but a Paul-like figure who appears to strengthen her resolve. The figure then ascends into heaven, prompting Thecla and the reader to understand that this was not Paul after all. This experience seems to affect her attitude toward Paul going forward, subtly shifting her spiritual allegiance. This moment also resonates with Pauline tradition, particularly the Corinthian letters, where Paul speaks of being transformed into Christ's likeness, blurring the boundary between apostolic identity and divine embodiment. In paragraph 25, or chapter 25 rather, Paul refuses Thecla's request to cut her hair and later declines to baptize her. Both of these scenes directly evoke themes from 1 Corinthians. Paul's criticism of women cutting their hair, his insistence that he was sent not to baptize but to preach the gospel, 1 Corinthians 11 and 1:17, and his emphasis on patience all echo through these episodes. Thecla ultimately baptizes herself, which shifts authority away from Paul and leaves his role in the narrative somewhat ambiguous, perhaps even diminished. These scenes also recall Paul's arguments in 1 Corinthians regarding women's speech, which he describes as aischros, often translated as shameful. This terminology may suggest Paul's underlying mistrust of Thecla as a disciple, or at least the threat her agency represents within the narrative or the broader context of Pauline teaching. However, the Slavic translation diverges significantly in this moment. The adjective aischros is not rendered with an equivalent term meaning shameful. Instead, Paul is made to say that the time is bad or wicked. In the second, latest Slavic translation from the 14th century, this becomes the time is hard, žestoko, or cruel, below on the slide. When we consult the Greek critical apparatus, we find that these renderings may derive from alternative Greek readings such as oneros, bad or grieving, or echthros, hostile. These are plausible textual variants and appear to be the most likely sources for the Slavic translations. This, of course, raises interesting questions about how translators, or perhaps even earlier Greek redactors, chose to soften or reframe Paul's rejection of Thecla. Rather than moralizing her desire or condemning her as inappropriate, the Slavic versions shift the blame to the context or timing, which may indicate a more sympathetic reception of Thecla's actions. Paul's decision to abandon Thecla to her fate in the hands of Alexander and his sexual advances, narrated in chapter 26, further reinforces his increasingly problematic role in the narrative. This scene alludes to 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul advises that if someone cannot control his passions, he should marry, notably without reference to the woman's agency in the matter. In this moment, Paul almost steps into the role of antagonist, acting in opposition to the protagonist rather than as her guide or protector. By contrast, Thecla's true allies are the women she encounters throughout her journey, anonymous bystanders at her trial, and most significantly, Queen Tryphena. These women provide the support and solidarity Paul withholds. In this way, Paul's character in the Act of Thecla echoes his ambivalent portrayal in the Corinthian letters, alternately inspiring and troubling, authoritative yet absent when most needed. This ambivalence culminates in their final encounter in paragraph or chapter 41. Here, Thecla visits Paul not to seek guidance, but merely as a courtesy, almost. She announces her intention to return to Iconium and preach on her own authority. Paul's brief response no longer carries the formative weight it once did. Thecla no longer requires his permission or instruction. However, the Slavic translation introduces an intriguing redactional moment. In the at an early stage redacted version of the first translation, referred to here as text version B, the particle li is inserted, transforming Thecla's statement into a question. Can I or should I go to Iconium? This subtle editorial decision shifts the power dynamic back toward Paul, restoring his authority at the very end. Whether this reading was present in the Greek exemplar is unclear, but the effect is significant. It re-establishes Paul's agency in a scene originally meant to showcase Thecla's independence. In the second translation into Slavic, dating from the 14th century, the original statement form is restored. However, even here the translator adds an extra phrase, "Pray for me," directed at Paul. This addition creates a dialogue where there was none, a softening the blow, as it were, of Thecla's independence and reintroducing Paul as an important, if secondary, spiritual figure. It's a subtle but telling example of how translation choices influence character dynamics and reader reception. Throughout the narrative, Paul is often described in negative terms by other characters, and within the logic of the story, not unexpectedly so. His followers, Demas and Hermogenes, are portrayed as hypocritical from the very start. They quickly betray him, helping Thamyris devise a plan to bring Paul to court. When recounting Paul's teachings, they emphasize only chastity and purity, suggesting that this is why Thecla no longer wishes to marry her fiancé, Thamyris. Their depiction reduces Paul's message to a narrow, socially disruptive doctrine. Thecla's mother, Thecla, is even more direct. She calls Paul a stranger, teaching deceiving and colorful words, destroying both the city and Thecla in the process. In the Slavic translation, the phrase is slightly altered. Paul is described as a stranger and a deceiver, teaching colorful words. Whether this alternative phrasing was already present in the Greek exemplar or was introduced during translation remains uncertain. In the 14th century Middle Bulgarian translation, we again see a textual shift. Paul is described as a strange man, conversing, deceiving, and different word. The translation of poikilos here as different is, of course, entirely plausible, as the Greek term can mean many-colored, variegated, or simply various. What's striking, however, is that Thecla, despite her condemnation, manages to offer a more correct reflection of Paul's broader appeal. She acknowledges that young men and women, both married and unmarried, are drawn to him and visit him in Iconium. In doing so, she unwittingly affirms the disruptive power and reach of his message. What remains to be discussed is perhaps the most intriguing passage in the Acts of Thecla concerning the character of Paul, namely his physical description. This moment recaptures the words of Paul's companion Titus, who describes him to Onesiphorus, a local citizen of Iconium. The description appears near the very beginning of the narrative in paragraph 3. The Greek text reads, "And he saw Paul coming, a man small of stature, bald-headed, bow-legged, in a good state of body, single-browed, a bit long-nosed, full of graciousness. Sometimes he looked like a mortal, and sometimes he had the face of an angel." This passage has been the focus of much scholarly analysis, summarized in an article of Bremer. But the most convincing interpretation connects the description to physiognomic traditions widely known in both antiquity and the Middle Ages. Again, Bremer. According to this tradition, most of the features listed, short stature, baldness, bow legs, a unibrow, and a long nose, carry negative connotations typically associated with weakness, ugliness, lack of intellect, or even femininity. Some scholars also link the duality of Paul's appearance, sometimes like a mortal, sometimes like an angel, to the figure of Stephen, the proto-martyr, reading this as a subtle allusion to Paul's eventual martyrdom. But perhaps more significant is how the unattractive portrayal underscores the power of Paul's speech. According to the narrative, Thecla never actually sees Paul's face initially, but is completely captivated by his preaching. His unattractiveness then serves to highlight that his persuasive power lies not in appearance, but in rhetoric. The Slavic translation reflects the Greek original almost entirely. The only notable omission is the phrase describing Paul as being in a good state of body, which is not preserved. Otherwise, his bald head, crooked legs, unibrow, and long nose are all retained. The critical apparatus confirms that there is no major confusion in the transmission of these terms in either the original or the later Slavic redactions. Only minor morphosyntactical variation occurs. However, in two South Slavic copies from the 15th century, Paul's crooked legs, unibrow, and long nose are omitted. These are most likely accidental omissions rather than deliberate changes. Overall, it seems that the first Slavic translator either made a conscious effort to preserve the physiognomic description faithfully, or understood its meaning well enough not to interfere with its function in the narrative. In contrast, the second translation of the Passion, produced in 14th century Middle Bulgarian, offers a dramatically different portrayal. Here the description reads, "A man small of stature, small concerning his head, pleasant in the face, gay concerning the eyes, full of grace. He sometimes appeared as a man, and sometimes as if he had the face of an angel." As of now, no Greek equivalent has been found for this alternative description. The most plausible explanation is that the meaning of the original passage was no longer clear, to the second translator. Rather than omitting the confusing detail, the translator chose to reinterpret Paul's appearance altogether, transforming it into a more idealized and positive portrayal of the apostle. This version omits nearly all of the features traditionally understood as unattractive or problematic: crooked legs, baldness, unibrow, and long nose, and replaces them with traits like a pleasant face and bright eyes. Paul is no longer physiognomically marked as weak or undesirable, but instead appears as a more spiritually and physically appealing figure. This shift is highly telling. It illustrates not only changing expectations about apostolic appearances in later Slavic Christian context, but also a growing discomfort with, it seems, negative portrayals of saintly figures, particularly as the text functions into a canonical liturgical space. In conclusion, the portrayal of the Apostle Paul in the Acts of Thecla is marked by ambivalence and transformation. From his initial introduction as a teacher and preacher, whose words captivate Thecla from afar, to his gradual retreat into the background of the narrative, Paul undergoes literary and ideological reconfiguration that significantly reshape his character. This evolution is made even more pronounced when considered alongside the Pauline letters, particularly 1 Corinthians, which acts as a central intertext throughout the narrative. Many of the key themes of the Acts of Thecla, chastity, marriage, renunciation, resurrection, and the role of women, find direct or allusive resonance in Paul's own writings. However, while 1 Corinthians presents Paul as both spiritual authority and social critic, particularly of women's speech and public roles, the Acts of Thecla takes these tensions and dramatizes them, exposing the fragility of Paul's authority when tested by Thecla's determination, charisma, and divine favor. In this light, Thecla can be seen as a kind of embodied midrash on Pauline teaching, living interpretation, and in some ways a correction or fulfillment of Paul's message. Where Paul in the letters struggles to balance spiritual equality with social order, the Acts of Thecla leans into the radical potential of his gospel, particularly its promise of a new social and spiritual order. Thecla's self-baptism, her independent mission, and her repeated deliverances by divine intervention suggest that she, not Paul, ultimately embodies the power and integrity of the message. The Slavic translations further deepen this story of transformation. In the first translation, we see efforts to remain faithful to the Greek, even at the cost of presenting Paul in a less than flattering light. In the second, later translation, there are clear signs that Paul's character is softened, idealized, and reframed, perhaps reflecting changing theological and liturgical needs. Small but meaningful changes, like turning Thecla's final statement into a question or softening Paul's physical appearance, reveal how translation becomes interpretation, shaping how communities read and revere sacred figures. Taken together, these observations point to a broader conclusion. The Acts of Thecla is not only a witness to early Christian storytelling or apocryphal creativity, it is also a commentary on apostolic authority, gender, and the reception of Scripture. By juxtaposing Paul's ambivalent representation with Thecla's clear moral and spiritual triumph, the text offers a subtle but powerful critique from within the Pauline tradition itself. In this way, the Acts of Thecla, especially when read in dialogue with 1 Corinthians, allows us to glimpse a richer, more contested early Christian landscape, one in which authority is not static but negotiated, not inherited but tested, and ultimately one in which voices like Thecla's rise to shape the very traditions that first inspired them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper showing how the tension in the narrative in the Greek text was also reflected in the two translations later on. So the floor is open to conversation. Feel free to just jump in. This is a nice small circle. Don't hesitate to throw in a comment or whatnot. Madalena, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Yeah, it was a very interesting case. So you spoke about the strange inclusion of Paul in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So I was wondering whether we have in manuscripts traces of the Acts of Thecla without the Pauline insertion. So do we have anything without Paul? Do we have some sort of a, yeah.
Where Paul as a character is completely erased, you mean?
Yes, or yeah.
I haven't come
Or
across.
it's really always, they're always linked.
Yeah.
They seem to be always linked.
Yes, I think they're always. Oh, well, I haven't occurred a version of the text without Paul. He's also. I mean, even though his insertion is rather awkwardly, in a sense. I mean, the story cannot continue without him either. We need the Apostle Paul in order for Thecla to grow as a protagonist as well, and to lean from the very beginning onto his authority, but then gaining the floor above him, so to say. So no, I haven't come across such a text, or not, at least not in the Middle Ages. Perhaps in later traditions, such a version might have come across.
Sorry. I have a follow-up question, but I think this is more like an exercise of imagination rather than a proper question. So do you imagine that in this scenario, was this insert, or was this, I mean, I don't know if insertion is the right word, was this them being, I mean, this association rather more helpful for the image of Thecla or for the image of Paul?
Good question. I think in a sense both. Or that perhaps that was the intention of the text in itself, to sort of clarify the obscure, in some sense, 1 Corinthians, and that image we have of Paul, in trying to assert yes, give a clearer picture of what Apostle Paul is supposed to be like, or how he should be interpreted in a sense. And then on the other hand, of course, Thecla was the main character, and as it has the characteristics of a hagiographical text, celebrates her as deserving the right to be called a saint in itself. So I think we can look at it from both sides, actually. Yeah, I think so.
Sophia,
thank you for the
please.
wonderful question, by the way.
No, thank you for the wonderful paper. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, for that very exciting paper, really. I have a question related to the thinking that Madalena just talked. Basically, I'm wondering, what do you mean exactly by the awkward or abrupt insertion of Paul? Could you elaborate on that a little bit, because
yes, because
it's not clear to
rather,
me.
yes, I mean, with his rather passive attitude. So he doesn't take on a very active role in the act itself. He almost ignores Thecla at moments, at crucial moments in her life story, creating that weird tension of, what are you doing? Why aren't you helping? You're supposed to be the sidekick or something like this, but he isn't. And I think it must have been confusing for listeners to this text because they have that. I think they would have that expectation of Apostle Paul being the hero, actually. But we do not see him in that role. Almost as if the opposite, because he ignores her wishes, he refuses to help her. Yes, which is kind of contradictory, unexpected of an apostle in some way. But on the other hand, of course, explained through 1 Corinthians very well, because of his ambivalent position right on those subjects. So it has definitely a deeper meaning, which should be looked for in this text, which is amazing.
Thank you. That's very curious, actually. And I also wonder if the text itself maybe suggests that the like everything written about Paul was inserted. Like, is there some abruptness in the narrative and some kind of not really well hidden sheets or whatever? What am I called, actually? So it's just about if a narrative suggests the insertions, or it's clean and coherent.
Well, I think the citations are very well chosen, and that makes it very clear for a well-read listener to pick up on these cues. So I think certainly for someone who knows the biblical scriptures, that would have the link with 1 Corinthians would have been quite clear. But of course, there are a few other citations from other of Pauline's texts. So it's not exclusively 1 Corinthians, but 1 Corinthians is strongest for sure, I think. We see it in almost every episode within the text. I hope I understood the question properly, because
Yes, and I was thinking along the lines, then, when you see really a text inserted into another text, like a more recent text inserted into the oldest, like a compilation of something. So sometimes the ages between these two texts, they are still kind of visible, and so you can actually see that it's that one, and this is something really later, and so this kind of things. I've been thinking in terms of like compilations that they have in mind, like post constitutions or this type of thing, maybe stylistically different things and even lexically different things. Does this difference exist in the Acts of Thecla and Paul?
In comparison to 1 Corinthians, for example, then you mean, or?
No, just everything you can actually say, not necessarily with Corinthians.
I'm not really sure.
Okay, but the narrative looks coherent, right? And the narrative and the style and everything. Okay, that's fine with me. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Alice, I've seen you waving it, please.
Hi. Yes, no, thank you, Amber. I was just wondering, in sort of earlier, like sort of late antique, sort of earlier sort of centuries, the sort of Thecla's kind of self-baptism is sort of met with some kinds of controversy, like in Tertullian. And I was like, and I was wondering whether there was any evidence in the sort of Slavic sort of manuscript or sort of tradition of this, I don't know, sort of act of hers controversial in terms of women's.
Yes, I have looked at this particular episode as well while I was working on my PhD. But weirdly enough, in the Slavic tradition, we don't see any problems with this particular episode. They simply introduce it as one of the episodes of the text, which kind of fits into the more general conclusion we made of the first translation as a whole, that it rather firmly follows the Greek original. We do not see too many differentiation, but then again in the second translation it's again the same. The episode is preserved, which is weird. To some extent, perhaps. But of course, we're talking already about a later context in which perhaps the controversy was not as vivid as ones before in the earliest periods. Knowing that these texts have perhaps some fictional element in them. I'm not sure whether perhaps in the later traditions, I have not worked on these texts myself. Another scholar, a Ukrainian scholar, has worked on later reception Ukrainian and East Slavic, Daria Siruit, and perhaps in these different versions we see a different approach towards this theme. But for sure in the Middle Ages it's preserved.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I guess Thecla's kind of exceptionalism, kind of apostolic or kind of authorities kind of. Just
absolutely.
take it granted. What about her? Sorry, if I may jump in like a part two. What about her kind of cross-dressing? Because that's into the Greek version, but it's not necessarily in some of the, like, I don't think it's in the Arabic version. I can't remember about the Coptic.
Yes, the same as with the previous episode. It's preserved. So we don't see any difference in approach of translating for this particular aspect of the text. No. I'm not sure why. I don't have a ready set explanation for it. Yes, I didn't see any. No, I don't think it. No, I don't think it has been omitted. No. Yes, which is fascinating. But we see that also in other hagiographies as well, in other hagiographical texts, and in Slavonic I know that they're preserved as well. Yes.
Madalina, I've seen you wave your hand first. Please.
If I can, I have another question about the second part of your presentation about the mentioning of Paul's, I mean, the description, the physical description of Paul. And if I understand correctly, so in one of the Slavonic versions, this, what is perceived as negative physical descriptions are sort of transformed, yeah? Do I understand you correctly? Do you, so, but this is happening only in one of the Slavonic versions, not in all of them, yeah?
Yes. So the original translation, the first translation, which is widespread and preserved in copies from the 11th century onwards until the, I think, 18th century, there we see the physical description as we know it from the Greek original. But in this second translation from the 14th century specifically, all of a sudden the translator chose to go in an entirely different way, which is still a little baffling, because well, I didn't find anything in the Greek transmission that could answer our questions there in the Slavic translation. But this translation is not as popular as the first original translation. So so perhaps it wasn't. Yeah, we shouldn't make too hasty conclusions about that. But the second translation is only preserved in 2 copies from the 15th century, which perhaps in some ways also telling. I don't know. But on the other hand, it's not as if for other episodes this translation is suddenly taking another route, as with the description of Paul either. So this is a key different approach in translation, I would say, for as far as my analysis is finished for a second translation, of course.
And do we know, I mean, how is it in Syriac? Is it, for instance, do we have this like the Greek, or do we have this Paul with a more negative or whatever perceived physical description? I mean, do we see this somewhere else?
I don't know. I cannot answer that question. But
yeah,
it would be interesting.
Yeah,
it would be definitely interesting to look at the other traditions, Syriac, Armenian, even to make a comparison. What's happening there? What for as far as I know, the Syriac tradition is allows more variation in the text as well. But I think there's someone working on Thecla still, a scholar.
Jacob Lawler.
Yes, exactly. And I should perhaps contact him and gather some input on this particular aspect, because I cannot say.
He has a book forthcoming on the arts of Thecla in Syriac. I don't know how advanced, but at some point he announced the cover, so he might be well underway.
That's pretty definitive. Yes.
I also have a question. Are both translations in Ultra-Slavonic, in Slavic, copied in liturgical manuscripts?
Both of the translations are most often preserved in what we call menologia, the Greek collections, or Greek
organized by month.
Yes, organized by month, only containing hagiographical texts, sometimes also laudations for particular holidays, and sometimes in other zborniki or collections, but that has to do with thematic, specific thematic focus, such as materikon, which does exist in the South Slavic reception, the Ptinsky Zbornik at Ghent University, or a monastic zbornik or collection with hagiographic lives of saints, with a specific thematic focus, so a specifically chosen text together. So most often in general, we only see this text in menologia.
Very interesting. You've mentioned at some point that the title, it has a history of its own, and that in later manuscripts, when it was included in this type of liturgical collections, it's focused on Thecla, and mentioned that the old title would be The Acts of Paul and Thecla. Is this the oldest title in terms of the manuscripts that we have, or the oldest title that we established on text critical basis? If you see my question.
Yes. Well, I am in contact with these the editors who are working at this very moment on the new edition of the Greek text, Jean-Daniel Kasli and Willy Roordorff.
Okay.
Yes, and they already have a base text, and for their base text, they chose this title, this particular title. But it's also the title, as we know of from the earliest dated fragments as well. So, but their edition is going to be text critical. They have a critical apparatus where they're working on, and it takes, of course, forever. So, so I'm pretty convinced that that should have been the original title of the text. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. As we know, often in critical editions, editors choose a title, and often with regard to the contents rather than the tradition.
Okay.
Sometimes that happens, but we know here we have that variation, and it's not impossible that that is the old title at all. So
Yes.
yeah, I was curious how you feel about that. Very interesting situation that you described here today. And so we don't go over the 1 hour time. I'd like to thank our speaker today, Amber, for a very interesting paper, and to everyone in the room for taking part in the conversation, which is always very fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just stop this.